Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Lunch and Learn webinar. My name is Kaitlyn Theberge, the Seafood Resources Knauss Fellow at the National Sea Grant Office and a member of the Lunch and Learn Committee. Our speaker is Zoe Wong, who is a Knauss Legislative Fellow working in the office of Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island. Zoe earned her master's degree in coastal environmental management from Duke University and has previously worked as an environmental educator in Hawaii and as a marine mammal research assistant in Maine. Today, Zoe will share her presentation entitled Aquaculture in the Senate, a Knauss Fellow's Path from Sustainability Research to Legislation. Take it away, Zoe.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to the Knauss Lunch and Learn Committee for inviting me to be here. And thanks for the great introduction, Kaitlyn. As Kaitlyn said, I'm going to be talking about aquaculture in the Senate, my path from sustainability research to legislation. And as part of that, my presentation will have two parts today. First, I'll talk about my graduate research, which was about aquaculture, a certain aspect of aquaculture. And then I'll shift and talk about my fellowship and the work I've been able to do on aquaculture in that regard. So as Kaitlyn said, I went to school at Duke University where I earned a master's in environmental management. My master's research focused on ensuring sustainability in Hawaii's open ocean aquaculture industry. So I'll break that down, but first want to share the goal of my research, which was to understand how regulators can ensure the holistically sustainable growth of Hawaii's open ocean aquaculture industry. So three things I want to highlight from that. First, regulators. I'm looking at this issue from a regulator's standpoint, from federal and state officials' perspectives, and how they can see the issue and help this open ocean aquaculture industry grow. Second, I'm looking at the holistically sustainable growth. And for me in my research, holistically sustainable means three things. It means environmental sustainability, which we usually think of when we hear that word, but it also means economic and social sustainability. So I looked at all three aspects of that issue. And then finally, open ocean aquaculture. I'm guessing some of you may not be familiar with open ocean aquaculture, so I've got some photos to share. They're all very pretty. The top two are surface cages, and these are going to be, as the name suggests, at the surface all of the time. In the left photo, you can see the fish in the cage. They're often located in bays close to shore. This is just one type of marine aquaculture. On the other hand, we have submersible cages. And the bottom two photos, as the name suggests again, these cages are submersible. They'll be underneath the surface most of the time. They can't come to the surface for maintenance or harvesting, etc. But you're not going to see them on the surface of the ocean. Submersible cages are usually located in deep waters with strong currents. And note that distance to shore is not necessarily a factor. You can see on the bottom right photo the big island of Hawaii in the background. And that's because even though it's close to shore, those ocean conditions of deep water and fast currents are found close to shore in Hawaii. So when I speak about open ocean aquaculture today, please think about these two bottom photos because that's the type of aquaculture I'm talking about. And this is going to be entirely finfish aquaculture. So why are we talking about this form of aquaculture in the first place? I like to think about it in terms of two buckets. The first is economic. In the US, we import a vast amount of our seafood, and so domestic open ocean aquaculture can provide a domestic source of seafood to meet our demand. On the other side, we have environmental factors. Aquaculture in general is known to have a number of potential environmental impacts. For example, land-based aquaculture has issues with water use, runoff, groundwater pollution, things like that. Open ocean aquaculture, while this is under debate, it has the potential to be done sustainably with minimal environmental effects. Research is still underway, but signs seem to indicate that if siting and management is done well for these farms, that it can be done sustainably. In Hawaii specifically, these factors are also at play, just in specific ways. On the economic side, Hawaii is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, which means that it has access to both Asian and US markets for both supplies, shipping in supplies, and also exporting fish product. And Hawaii also faces the same issues that the nation does with regards to seafood demand and imports. On the environmental side, Hawaii has a huge marine area with stable temperatures, which means that you can cultivate fish a little bit easier. It has strong currents close to shore, which can help minimize those environmental impacts of the fish farm. And it also has deep waters close to shore, which makes it much easier to manage a farm. There is a bunch of federal interest in open ocean aquaculture, especially from NOAA. And so this topic and this industry is, although it's young and nascent, it is growing and interest is growing. I'll say my personal interest came from my time in Hawaii. I lived in Maui for a couple of years as an environmental educator. I ate fish from Hawaii's one commercial open ocean aquaculture farm while I was there, which was delicious. And I also actually was able to visit one of Hawaii's experimental open ocean aquaculture farms while I was there. So personal and professional interest for me. Quickly about the methods of my research. I did a literature search, but as this industry is new, there's not a lot of information, especially about economic and social sustainability. And so the bulk of my research took place during stakeholder interviews through agency folks, industry representatives, and NGO representatives. I unfortunately wasn't able to talk to any researchers, and missing from this slide is Native Hawaiians. If I had more time, more ability to do this research, I would absolutely have wanted to form those connections and interview Native Hawaiians. During my interviews, I asked mainly questions around two themes. First, how will the industry's growth affect the people who live and work in Hawaii? And what are the opportunities or obstacles to growth for this industry? And again, the current state of the industry in Hawaii consists of one single farm that's operational on the Big Island. So for the results portion of this presentation, for the sake of time, I'll just focus on social considerations. Again, remember that I looked at environmental, economic, and social sustainability, but I'll just talk about social here. And those considerations for regulators to consider break down to three buckets, which I'll discuss. So the first bucket is bridging mistrust. I'm sure many of you know that there's a long history of Western oppression in Hawaii, both from the government and also from private sources. One of the stakeholders that I interviewed said, one thing that is often overlooked is the history of Hawaii and how the Hawaiian government was overthrown. There's generational trauma attached to that. This legacy of generational trauma is alive and well in Hawaii. It's continued to play out even after the overthrowing of the Hawaiian government. I think we even see it to a degree today with the response to the Maui wildfires and the distrust that the public has expressed. And so this is a context that the government, especially the federal government, is working in when it comes to Hawaii and potentially tries to set up an open ocean aquaculture industry or promote that industry, and absolutely something to consider and be aware of the context that they're working in. There are also some major differences between Western and Hawaiian culture, namely in this context, issues around open ocean access. In Western culture, privatization is sort of the norm. Open ocean aquaculture farms require a set area of the ocean that would be sort of cordoned off from any other ocean users. On the other hand, in Hawaiian culture, the ocean is extremely important and open ocean access is really important. They believe that the ocean should be open for anyone's use. It's a common resource. And so there's a direct conflict between those Western and Hawaiian ways of treating the ocean that play directly into this open ocean aquaculture industry. So mistrust is a major factor for regulators to be aware of. Second factor is the needs of the local communities. There are absolutely going to be economic trade-offs for the local community. I think when we think about new industries, we think about jobs often. And definitely open ocean aquaculture farms could provide jobs for the local community. But on the other hand, some of my interviewees express concerns that those jobs would not be accessible to them. Open ocean aquaculture is heavily industry, capital intensive, investment intensive, and education intensive. It's very specialized. And so the jobs that might be needed to operate these type of fish farms might not be ones that the local community could fill in the first place. There's also going to be issues with, again, like I mentioned in the previous slide, ocean access and use. The communities want to know how, even if the farm benefits them economically, will it cut off their ocean access, which they use for other things, including other economic reasons. And then finally, there were concerns about the accessibility of the fish product that comes from these farms. On the left, one of my stakeholders said, how are they going to market it being the fish product? Is it going to be for the people to feed people, or is it going to be something that is for the wealthy? In Hawaii, again, there's a legacy of foreigners or outsiders coming in to take Hawaiian resources for the benefit of tourists or outsiders. And so local communities were concerned that this may turn out to be the same story, that the fish product coming from these farms may use their ocean resources, but it may not be priced at a price point that they'd be able to afford, or it may not be sold in the markets that they're able to access, or it may be exported altogether. And so concerns about that aspect, and this sort of goes back to the first point of bridging mistrust. And then thirdly, a concern for regulators to consider would be the concerns of fishermen. Market competition will always be something that fishermen bring up with respect to aquaculture, especially if the fish being cultivated are in direct competition with a local wild catch. I'll note that the current operational farm in Hawaii cultivates a species of fish that is not wild caught, and so that they've alleviated that concern in that way. This is definitely something for regulators to be aware of and to consider which species they might be willing to regulate. There's also the quote on the right-hand side speaks to that. A stakeholder asked, who are the local fishermen that you could basically be putting out of business, and what does that mean for them and their livelihood? So again, that common concern that we hear a lot from fishermen when it comes to aquaculture. There's also going to be a fish aggregation device effect on other species from these farms. We know that that's been documented around open ocean aquaculture farms, and so local fishermen are worried that that could change the fish distribution in other areas where they usually fish. And finally, the fishermen are worried that there might be a disruption of fishing grounds and practices. This again goes back to the ocean access issue that I spoke about earlier. Again, cordoning off an area of the ocean means that fishermen won't be able to fish in the vicinity of an open ocean aquaculture farm, and therefore they might lose access to fishing grounds that they and their families have fished for generations, and lose the ability to access that tradition. So a quick recap of these considerations for regulators to be aware of when they think about the social sustainability of an open ocean aquaculture industry, bridging that generational mistrust, directing the benefits of these farms to local communities, and making sure to address concerns from fishermen. A few recommendations from those are mainly one recommendation, which is that regulators absolutely must engage authentically with stakeholders from the beginning. Again, the Hawaiian situation is incredibly unique, especially given this generational mistrust, the history of Hawaii. And so stakeholder engagement, especially with an extremely Western industry, which I say because, again, open ocean aquaculture is going to be extremely capital investment intensive, and it's coming from outside. It's not something that locals would be able to necessarily do on their own. That having a Western industry grow in the region is definitely will play into that generational mistrust that I spoke about. So authentic stakeholder engagement will be incredibly important from the very start. So for this portion of the presentation from my graduate research, I want to thank the Duke Nicholas School of the Environment, where I did the research, my advisor, Grant Murray, as well as the interviewees who donated their time to the research. So I'll transition now to my fellowship. Again, keeping the same broad theme of aquaculture, but there are also some common threads between my research and my fellowship that I'll speak about later. But for now, I'll just highlight the importance of engaging with those local interviewees and stakeholders from whom I was able to learn those lessons about social sustainability and who the government must absolutely engage to be able to develop that industry sustainably. So once again, I am a Knauss Fellow on the legislative side with the Office of Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island. I'm going to speak less about my day-to-day, significantly less about my day-to-day, since Jeff already covered some of the broad tasks that a legislative fellow will cover. I will, however, share my portfolio, which is a little different than Jeff's. I broadly cover oceans, environment, agriculture, and nutrition, and I've listed some examples of each of those underneath. I will say, I'll point out aquaculture, of course, given the topic of this presentation, and also point out that I listed it under agriculture. Usually I would think about aquaculture under oceans, but this year, because this year is a Farm Bill reauthorization year, that means that aquaculture, for my purposes, fits squarely under agriculture. For those who don't know, the Farm Bill is a big bill, sort of like the FAA reauthorization that Jeff spoke about. It comes up every 5 years, so this year is one of them. It's an amalgamation of different authorizations of new programs, reauthorizations of old ones, funding, adjusting different programs, all under one umbrella. And I want to speak specifically about one bill that I've been able to work on, which is the Shells Act. This bill was introduced in June 2023 by our office, and the bill primarily creates a program office for aquaculture within the USDA. The responsibilities of that office would be to oversee aquaculture programs, provide technical assistance to farmers, support producers and farmers with resources and funding, and of course, collaborate with other agencies, especially NOAA, given NOAA's expertise in aquaculture. The bill also sets up an advisory council to guide the program office, which would be comprised of stakeholders, industry members, anyone, basically representatives from every stage of the aquaculture process, from production all the way to marketing and sales. The bill was introduced with 3 co-sponsors. We now have 6 total, including the Whitehouse office. We introduced it with bipartisan support, which is really important, something I'll talk about in a minute. We also did have a House companion. That's an identical House bill introduced in the House. That bill was bipartisan, and it was led by Representative Bonamici from Oregon. And we are targeting the bill, as I mentioned, for Farm Bill inclusion. So we're hoping that this small bill becomes one of the many bills that will be combined, aggregated to become this year's Farm Bill. So I want to use the Shells Act to walk through the legislative process. This is, and tell you how I've experienced on the way. So obviously the concept stage is first. You have to have an idea for a bill before you write the bill. In this case, the concept for this bill came out of conversations with stakeholders, Rhode Island aquaculture producers, regional aquaculture groups, also local USDA officials who are working on the ground directly with farmers. Through all of those conversations, we heard that aquaculture farmers have been mostly unable to access USDA resources. There have been many obstacles, lack of information from the USDA, lack of awareness from local USDA officials that aquaculture is covered under some of their programs, lack of knowledge in general on both sides. And so this program office idea was meant to increase the profile of aquaculture at the USDA within the agency at large, and make sure that farmers are able to have access to the resources that they should have access to. The USDA does have a federal mandate with regards to aquaculture, even though probably most of the public and probably many staff at the USDA probably think of aquaculture as within NOAA's domain. The USDA still has a federal mandate in law, and so its programs, it should be providing resources to aquaculture producers. So after we had the concept for the bill, we moved to the drafting phase. I wrote this bill based on a program office that was created in the previous 2018 Farm Bill. I also worked with what we call Legislative Council, which is a team of lawyers within the House and the Senate who know how to take our ideas and put them into legal language. So worked closely with those folks. And then once we had a good draft of the bill that did what we wanted it to do, we put it out for technical assistance, or TA. In this case, we asked for technical assistance from NOAA and USDA, even though the bill doesn't really do anything with regards to NOAA except for directing the USDA to collaborate with NOAA in some cases. NOAA obviously has plenty of aquaculture expertise and even its own Office of Aquaculture, and so that was really important to include. We also got some TA from aquaculture groups, a couple nonprofits, and advocacy groups as well, and revised the bill based on all of that technical assistance and suggestions. Then moving on to the fourth step, once we had almost final version of the bill, I reached out to co-sponsors. The Agriculture Committee has been really firm that they want this farm bill to be bipartisan, and so we prioritized that for this bill. And that meant reaching out primarily to Republican offices first, given that we are a Democratic office. So I reached out to a number of Republican offices well before I reached out to any Democrats in the hopes of making this bill bipartisan. We were able to secure a Republican co-sponsor, and so moved forward with introduction, which I have as the fifth step. Importantly, introduction is not the last step. That's definitely something I thought when I started this position, but introducing the bill is not the end of the line. There's lots of outreach to be done, and for this bill specifically, I've done a lot of outreach in three ways. Firstly, outreach to co-sponsors, trying to recruit more co-sponsors. We initially introduced the bill with 3 co-sponsors and now have 6 on the bill. We have more in the wings and are hoping to get more Republican co-sponsors on as well. All of that just to show support from multiple offices and multiple regions, and to show the Agriculture Committee in this context that the bill is popular and something that we need in the Farm Bill. Second, outreach has been to the committee directly, the Agriculture Committee. They're the ones through which this bill needs to pass to make it into the Farm Bill and eventually into law. And so I've reached out to the committee and spoken with them a few times to make sure they're aware of the bill, that they know what it does, understand it, and also that they understand why it's important, why it's a good fit for the Farm Bill, and that why it's necessary that the USDA does more on aquaculture in general. And then thirdly, we've also reached out or been reached out to by other groups. So these are national aquaculture or regional aquaculture groups, nonprofits as well, or advocacy groups. Many groups have reached out to us to express their support for the bill and ask how they can help. Outside groups can help us get co-sponsors, they can publicize the bill, and help it gain support in that way. And so that outreach to outside groups, interested groups, has been important for this bill as well. So that's sort of the legislative process in a nutshell. This is going to be different for every bill. For example, the Shells Act was pretty fully formed by the time we introduced, but that's not the case for many bills, and many, if not all, bills will go through changes as they go through the committee process on their way to becoming law. There may be a push for co-sponsors before you introduce and less of a push after. It really varies, but that's been the experience for the Shells Act. And then finally, a couple common threads to tie this all together. Obviously, I've themed my talk around 2 aquaculture projects, but I think the core thread here is community-based policy. As I mentioned when talking about my graduate research, listening to the community, hearing local perspectives was really important for me to understand social sustainability in the context of open ocean aquaculture, and it will be incredibly important as regulators consider how they'd like to move forward that industry. In the same way, for the Shells Act, listening to constituents and stakeholders was absolutely essential to the bill. We wouldn't have the bill without having been able to hear from our local producers and hear the problems that they needed solved. That's where the bill came from, and so it was crucial to this process. Someone said recently to me that the best bills come out of constituent need, and that's exactly where this bill came from. So in both of those aspects, listening to the community has been really important, and something that I have firmly believed in and have seen the importance of through experience. I want to thank the National Sea Grant Office, the Knauss Fellowship, Lunch and Learn Committee, of course, Mariah Flager, my supervisor, and Team Whitehouse, who I love working with every day. I'm happy to take questions, and I'll also say I'm happy to take questions about my legislative experience in general, because I know I didn't talk about that as much as Jeff was able to. So thank you all so much.